Thanks, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about Sierra Leone, and I'm going to try and pack an awful lot into a short presentation. I guess a key theme around this is about the differences that other people have picked up on in here, is like Galtung's distinctions between different types of peace. And for him, a kind of positive peace was about, fundamentally was about justice. And in Sierra Leone, in terms of moving on from a decade-long civil war, there was this attempt at transitional justice, which had, for those of you who know about it, both retributive and restorative mechanisms. It had this special court for Sierra Leone, which was about punitive sentencing of particular individuals. It was very much focused on a very small elite who were going to be tried and prosecuted. So it didn't necessarily generate the kind of broader sense of accountability and justice being done to all Sierra Leoneans. There was also a kind of parallel process of restorative justice, loosely based on South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And these were about more restorative approaches, about people coming forward and telling the truth about what had happened. Now, to cut a very long kind of story short, these were not necessarily successful, I think, by anyone's standards, in particular because it was broadly seen that the state itself, in particular elite actors connected to the state and to the elites within the rebels especially, were not necessarily buying into the process. Moreover, that the wider public themselves were not necessarily buying into this Truth Commission process, wanting to forget rather than to publicly have to go through the trauma of reliving and recounting the tales of the Civil War once again. Moreover, on top of that, the very presence of the Special Court for Sierra Leone alongside these restorative justice mechanisms fundamentally undermined the processes of truth commissions, because people thought, for example, rumours in Freetown were that there were trapdoors within the truth commissions and people would be led off to the Special Court and tried and prosecuted if they said too much during the truth commissions. And I think what was really interesting that came out of it as well was that, a lot of people didn't see these truth commissions as yielding the kind of justice that they wanted. Quite often people were going into this process demanding much more in terms of reparations, in terms of direct transfers, but also more broadly educational opportunities, employment, things that the state, the predatory state in Sierra Leone, had rarely given them in the past. And so it was a demand for something much bigger than a kind of narrow liberal peace-building agenda that was connected to this idea about truth commissions. And sure enough, the British led this major project, particularly the Department for International Development in Sierra Leone, after the war, this major liberal project, what David Harris calls the liberal testing laboratory, where they tested a whole load of ideas about liberal peace building on the Sierra Leonean state. Fundamentally, though, what I want to argue is that hasn't necessarily challenged the very nature of the gatekeeper state in Sierra Leone, and I think that this is the root centre of some of the injustices that we continue to see in Sierra Leone and the lack of a genuine positive peace. So a gatekeeper state, in very short, is an idea developed first by Frederick Cooper, and what he's talking about there is that historically the imperial states, the colonial empire in Africa, would try to form states, but really did so on the cheap, right? In particular, what they would do is try to gain some semblance of empirical sovereignty, control over the territory of these states that they had drawn up very radically in Berlin. And they would do so by ruling indirectly, what Mamdani, of course, famously refers to as the indirect rule. Now, the process that this meant was that they'd have to co-opt local authorities to rule on behalf of the crown. So effectively, you would outsource responsibility for vast areas of the state and state provisions to traditional leaders and paramount chiefs in Sierra Leone's case in particular. And what you would do is you would dispense patronage through a clientelistic network in return for their loyalty and support of the colonial project. Those that didn't support the colonial project would be cut out of that patronage in terms of access to jobs, development assistance, prestige, title, symbolic authority, and so on. Now, what symptoms of this as well, though, is, this is where the gatekeeper thing comes in, is that state elites effectively act as gatekeepers to the outside world. Their sovereignty is premised upon their connections to the outside world and the external resources that derive from their juridical sovereignty. So their legally recognized sovereign control over Sierra Leone allows them to access aid, loans, material assistance of all sorts from the outside world, and their rule, their empirical control over their country is based on the dispensation of those resources along patron-client networks. And that was a core focus of the spread of power of the state. Cooper famously argued that what we saw in post-colonial Africa was the successor states, which were still gatekeeper states, but now with post-colonial elites in charge, but still the very same problems and tensions with regards to the lack of power and adequate control still remained, and they still continued to govern in this kind of way. Now, I think what we can see here in Sierra Leone is that after the war, you almost get the kind of the cementing of this kind of gatekeeper relationship, in particular because DFID quite remarkably renews the same colonial project of restoring the paramount chiefs in Sierra Leone after the Civil War, because it realized that DFID couldn't really build the strong liberal state institutions on its own, and that it had to govern once again indirectly by re-establishing the power of the chiefs through what was widely euphemistically referred to as the decentralization agenda. But once again, we can see this kind of predatory state being formed, one which quite often is unable to provide basic services, as was laid particularly bare during the Ebola pandemic, which I've written about quite extensively. But also we've got the same predatory relations in terms of global capitalism, in terms of Sierra Leone's place within a very asymmetrical power in the world capitalist order, in particular that external dependence on a very few amount of resources that it exports to the global economy, particularly iron ore. The volatility of that iron ore price in particular means that Sierra Leone's government is consistently wrestling with the challenges of not having any sort of predictable budgetary powers. And on top of that, of course, you've got an economy that is particularly vulnerable to debt. And at current levels, Sierra Leone's debt is around about 54% of its GDP and increasing year on year. It's becoming part of a broader story of Africa's impending debt crisis. So Sierra Leone at the moment ranks 184th out of 189 states with regards to human development indicators. And I think that it's quite a clear example of a state that after the war has existed with a form of what Galton would call negative peace, the absence of direct personal violence to a large degree. Of course, these are not absolutes but spectrums. But it very much is one that doesn't really enjoy a positive peace in terms of the absence of structural violence. Indeed, what we can see today is perhaps an entrenched form of structural violence where populations are still systematically excluded along various kind of intersectional inequalities in Sierra Leone, whether it be rural-urban divides, whether it be around gender, whether it be around ethnicities and the relationship between the core in Freetown and other sections of the population. But I think to bring this back onto a discussion about resilient peace and how useful that is, I mean, I think what we're seeing perhaps, and what Jonathan was talking about earlier, is an Anglo-Saxon ideal with regards to resilient peacemaking that comes into the discourses about building resilient health systems, resilient education systems, resilient governance in Sierra Leone and these kinds of developing states. But nonetheless, I think what underpins this discourse is a lack of political ambition and perhaps political will to embrace a far more transformatory and inclusive agenda for building change. And I think that the idea that some sort of resilient peace can be founded on the principle of merely avoiding direct violence through liberal institution buildings, narrow and incomplete applications of transitional justice, not only lacks a kind of broader political ambition, but also it lacks the understanding of the very interwoven nature of structural violence and personal violence in gatekeeper states, where you have constant systematic relations of exclusion and inequality in these states. The relationship between direct personal violence and structural violence is so interwoven that I think if we're going to talk about resilient peace, or indeed jettison that for a more useful kind of terminology and ambitious project, we have to understand that these things are fundamentally intertwined, and we have to understand the very nature of state power in order to start transforming and building different projects of peace building that take those kinds of things into account. I'll end there.